I don't know about you, man, but I love me some roller coasters. Like whether it's Six Flags or Universal Studios or even the couple I have at Disney World, like I just love being on a roller coaster. In fact, my favorite moment, is the moment right at the top or right after the top. You're going like kick up and you get to the very top and you're like, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. And then all of a sudden you feel weightless and people lose their minds, and they're like, ah! That's my favorite moment of roller coasters. But here's my point. I think for a lot of us, a roller coaster is a great picture of how many of us feel when it comes to our faith, or how many of us feel when it comes to our relationship with God. I bet, in fact, if you could draw your relationship with God like on a piece of paper, some of you would draw something like this. You have times where you feel really close to God, and you have times where you feel pretty far from Him. It's like you're down here, okay, and you're just chilling, doing your thing, playing sports, going to class, texting a few girls, like getting your swerve on, you know what I'm saying? And yeah, you believe in God, and maybe you go to church sometimes, but you also have your struggles. Sure, everybody does. Like maybe you party some on the weekends, and God's not happy about that. Or you have a girlfriend, and you guys, cross some lines physically pretty often. And God loves you, but in the back of your mind, you're not really close to Him, like during this time or this season. You're not really following what He wants you to do. But then you went on a church retreat or something huge like that. Like you went to a camp at the beach or in the mountains or something, and there was a guy talking on stage, and it was exciting, and something like struck you. Like you felt like you heard God or met God, and you, either in a worship song or in the middle of a sermon, you were like, whoa, and you experienced God in a way that you hadn't before. And you came out of that weekend or that week or whatever it was, like up here, feeling so close to God. You were so determined to do some things differently with your friends or on the weekends or with your boyfriend or your girlfriend or in your quiet time in the morning. You're like, I'm going to do it. I'm going to pray. I'm going to read the Bible. I'm going to go to church. I'm going to be so close to God. And it just felt awesome, Like you felt so cool up here at the peak. God's really doing stuff in my life and it's great. I feel close to Him. Then I don't feel like I can hear Him. I see Him showing up in my world. It's great. But then what happens 3 months later? If you're like anything like me, you've been up here and then you've let 3 months pass and you find, it starts to fade, You find yourself struggling with the same things again, like you're going out on your own, away from God all over again, saying no thanks to God, feeling kind of distant again, not really reading the Bible, you're not really praying anymore, you're kind of not going to church as much. We've all been there. In fact, I think a lot of us, we could draw our relationship with God and it might look a lot like this right here. We've all been in this cycle. We've been in a valley. We've been in a peak. And we've been, it's fading. And I think that's a big moment when you realize that this is going on in your relationship with God, because you have to answer this question. What happens when you fail in your relationship with God? What happens when you go back? Like, I was so close to Him, but then I went back. What happens when you walk away? What happens when you're up at the peak, but for whatever reason, even to your own frustration, you go right back into a valley? What then? You see, most of us are just like me, and what you do is you just feel like crud. You feel guilty or sad or disappointed. But you also feel kind of paralyzed if you're anything like me, because you're like, I know He's disappointed. I'm sure God's probably mad, but I'm not sure how to make it up to Him. I mean, how to feel close to Him again. How to get out of this old rut, how to climb back up the mountain to the peak. And even if I did know, who knows if I have the time or the willpower to do it. And so we have a tendency, a lot of us, to just kind of wander around right here. Because we know what it's like to have been close to God at one point, to have been a church person at one point, to be really doing all the right things, but then we've seen it fade, or we've failed, or we've messed up, and we're like, oh my gosh, how do I get back up to the top? Is God mad at me? I don't know if I can. I don't know about you, but I spend a lot of time in valleys. I spend maybe even weeks and months of my life, or I have spent in valleys, just waiting for something, like maybe the next special event. And it's because that we believe that more or less that God lives here. This is where God is. And this is where you find Him. This is where you experience Him. This is where you see Him in your life. And when you're here, it's great. But if you fail, if you fall, when you walk away or you go back into the valley, then all bets are off. You're out of the picture because God's up here. We're off the reservation. We're pushed to the sidelines. To fail God is to offend God, we think. To fail God is to forfeit God, we think. And so the story of our relationship with God, when we tell it, it's this right here. And the question I just want to ask, like, what if we're wrong? What if this is not how God sees our relationship with him at all? What if there's more going on in these valleys than we thought? What if these times, the low times, are actually some of the most important, most defining times in our relationship with God? What if they aren't just wasted? What if these times actually have more potential than we think? What if God is a lot closer and a lot more involved and has much more of a plan here in the lows than we ever thought? And that's what Israel found out. They had a wow moment with God, if you remember, like a relationship starting moment. And those people were called the Israelites. And they find themselves in slavery in the country of Egypt, crying out to God for deliverance. Maybe you know the story. Well, one day God comes to an Israelite named Moses and he says, I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty. Moreover, I have heard the groaning of the Israelites whom the Egyptians are enslaving, and I have remembered my covenant, my promise. That's what we talked about last week. And so God comes to a guy named Moses, and he sends Moses to bring his people out of Egypt. And what happens next, you probably know, is amazing. God sends these plagues, he performs miracles, he parts the Red Sea for his people, and brings them out of Egypt. Like the promise was happening, like literally before their eyes, the promise spoken to Abraham long ago, it was coming into being, it was becoming a reality. God was taking his people out of Egypt and planning to make them into a great nation. So this was a top of the mountain, peak of the roller coaster kind of moment. Like it didn't get any better than this. It is just like you and me in those oh wow moments when we feel so close to God and everything's so great and awesome. But the Israelites, like us, they didn't stay there. Because as you read the story, you start to read phrases like this. Fresh out of Egypt. Fresh out of the Red Sea. Fresh from seeing miracle after miracle after miracle. And then you read this. In the desert, the whole community grumbled. They start to complain. Like, they start to complain about the food. Hello, God's providing miraculous food for them in the desert. And they start to complain about it. And they start to complain about all the time it's taking. Like, when are we going to get there? Like, they start to wonder if all this waiting and all this walking is even worth it. They start to doubt if God is really going to do what he said. Like, is God really going to make us into a nation? I'm not sure now. Like, if God can really provide for them and protect them. They're doubting it all. And it gets so bad that at one point, they're ready to outright walk away from God. Check this out. It says, all the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, Moses' sidekick. And the whole assembly said to them, if only we died in Egypt or in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? It's like, what? And they said to each other, we should choose a leader and go back to Egypt. And you're like, dude, you got to be kidding me? The spiritual high they had with God already just a couple of months later starts to fade. And they start to fall away. And they even turn to other gods at one point and worship other gods. And what's crazy is that this becomes their story. I mean, you read through the story and you see this. This is what happens over and over and over with them. It's back and forth and up and down and back and forth. High on God, low on God, close to God, ready to give up on God, faithful to God, disobedient to God, over and over and over and over again. But what I want to point out is that all this time through the up and the down and the up and the down and the up and the down, it's like, what in the world could God do more for you? But yet up and down and up and down. All this time, the story just keeps going. It just keeps going, like God keeps going. The people may have been on and off, up and down, but God wasn't. He kept working. He wasn't distracted by who they were. He was committed to who they could become. A great nation, a great people, his people, who had a great relationship with him and a great impact on the world. He wasn't distracted by their performance. He was committed to the promise. So when they were in the peak, God was there working and leading and making them into the people that he wanted them to be. And when they were in the valley, God was still there, Still working, still leading, still making them into the people that he called them to be. And that's what you need to know about your life and your story. Yeah, you're going to have ups and downs. Sometimes you're going to be a great Christian who obeys and does everything that God wants you to do. And sometimes you're not. You're going to have peaks and you're going to have valleys, but God's not distracted by who you are. He's committed to who you could become. And he sees something amazing in you. And that's amazing news because it means your relationship with God, it isn't limited just to these moments right here. It's not limited to the next camp you're going to go to. It's not limited to the next spiritual high experience you're going to have, because it doesn't matter whether you're high or low, up or down, on fire or feeling cold. God doesn't change. You might be up and down, but he isn't. You might be off and on, but he's not. You might be in and out, but he is not. He doesn't back off or disengage. He wants you to see him and experience him in the whole thing. Whether you're in a peak or a valley, you're always in with God. That's how I want you to remember it. Whether you're in a peak or in a valley, you're always in with God. You see what I'm saying? Like, you're always in his plan. You're always in his purpose. You're always in the middle of his working in your life. You're always in the middle of the amazing vision that he has for you. God works here in the peak just as much as he works here in the valley. He uses you here just as much as he wants to use you here. He loves you here in the peak just as much as he loves you in the valley. He's with you here in the peak just as much as he's with you in the valley. God does not change. And in fact, many of you, what you're going to find in years down the road, when you look back and when you tell your story or your testimony, you're going to find that the times where God worked the most and where he showed up the most and where he gave you the most grace and the most love and did the most in your life wasn't the peak, but in fact was the valleys. The times where you just felt far, the times where you felt like, oh, I failed. Oh, I did it again. And so that's the picture that we get from this huge chunk of God's story with the Israelites, a people going like this, but a God who's still going forward anyway. And you know what made the difference for them? What made the difference is what they decided to do when they found themselves down here. And the choice that they had to make was, okay, I failed, or I've fallen away, or I feel far from God again, for the 15th time. What am I going to do? Am I going to wander around, stay here, or am I going to follow? Because they had plenty of times of wandering. Like, if you read the story, they wandered for a long time in the desert, just wasting time, just wasting opportunity, experiencing the consequences, not being the people God wanted them to be, missing out on the promises. But then, sure enough, after a little while, they'd come to their senses and realize that God was still there. He hadn't gone anywhere. He wasn't unfaithful. He was still committed, still ready to press forward, and they would just choose to follow. They go, okay, God. Okay, where to? Just from wherever I am, where do you want me to go? Show us the next step. And that's a choice that we have to make when we find ourselves in a valley. Are we going to wander, be paralyzed and stalled, or are we just going to follow? Because it doesn't matter where you are, you're in with God. Whether you're in a peak or in a valley, you're in. So just decide to follow whatever step God has out in front of you. This is how your whole life can become the story of your relationship with God. Not just like the peaks, This is how your whole life can be the story of God working and changing and being with you. Not just the times where you feel super close to him. When you realize that you might be up and down, but God isn't. You might be in and out, but he's not. And whether you're in a peak or in a valley, you're in with God. He's not concerned about who you are in the moment. He's focused on who you can be and who you're becoming. And he's committed to that. And so I just want to challenge you from wherever you are right now, wherever you find yourself on the roller coaster that can sometimes be your relationship with God. I just want to ask you, what are you going to do? Are you going to wander or are you going to follow? Because you might be in a valley, but you're still in with God. He's still working. He's still got a plan for you. He still wants to do something awesome in your life right now. And he still loves you incredibly.